So today we're going to be talking about layers of information. Anybody want to try and guess what Bible story we're actually talking about? Any ideas? That's correct, Ben. Yes, it is the flood. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about just the evidence which we have so far from that. Okay, and so what we're going to start with is laying out a sentence which answers in Genesis is to thank for this sentence. It's billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the, anybody want to guess the last one? Earth. Yes, Earth, exactly. Okay, so we have billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth, right? And so that's the evidence, right? We're looking around the earth and we see these things. What do we call those in a scientific word? Does anybody know what the scientific name for all these billions of dead things is? What?
Fossils.
Fossils, that's exactly right, okay? So we have fossils, and they're all over the earth. Now, according to evolutionary scientists, this water, which laid down the rock layers, was from a prehistoric shallow sea. What's a prehistoric shallow sea? Anybody know? I don't know what it is exactly either. It's a bunch of water which was kind of shallow, but enough to have animals in it, at least sea animals, and it just covered certain localized areas is their idea behind it, right? Okay, and they take this and they say, okay, there's a prehistoric shallow sea in lots of different places. There was one in California. There was one right here in the Rocky Mountains with us. I mean, Dinosaur Ridge, just down the hill from where we live. They say if you go take their tour, they'll tell you there was a prehistoric shallow sea, which is what helped create the fossils of the dinosaurs on Dinosaur Ridge. Well, guess what? There was also a prehistoric shallow sea at the Grand Canyon, and there was a prehistoric shallow sea in Kentucky at Mammoth Caves, and I bet there's a prehistoric shallow sea on the East Coast too. So we've covered the entire U.S. at that point, from 5,280 feet at Denver to California and Kentucky and all those other places. But that's not the only place in the world where there's been prehistoric shallow seas. There was a prehistoric shallow sea in Asia on the top of Mount Everest. Very shallow, right? And then there's a prehistoric shallow sea in Europe and Asia and Africa, and wherever you go, there's prehistoric shallow seas. Now, the coincidence of that is, wouldn't it have been easier if it was just all one sea, right? I mean, think about that. If you have prehistoric shallow seas everywhere, what's the difference between having an actual sea that's covered the whole entire earth, right?
If Everest is covered.
Yeah, especially if Everest is covered. Although there is argument for Everest not being quite as tall as it was when the Fountains of the Great Deep broke open. But yeah, okay, so let's look at this, okay? According to evolution, they find certain things in certain layers of this, layers of rock, and they label them as different eras. And so I've got a few of the things which they find in layers. They're not exactly everything. That's why I've got dots in between each one. There's probably even more up above the birds too. But this is the order in which they find certain things. So the deeper you go, the different animals or things which they find in the fossils. So they take this to mean this is how things developed. They say the first type of life was plant life. After plant life came sea life. After sea life came land life, including dinosaurs. Yes, I know I bumped them all together with the dinosaurs, but we see a lot of dinosaur fossils, so. And then after dinosaurs came birds. And so they say they evolved plants into sea animals into land animals, and dinosaurs into birds, okay? And that's their order of organization. But let's look at it from a biblical worldview for a second, because we're all looking at the same evidence. We're just looking at it through different worldviews, different lenses, right? Our lens is the Bible, right? And so when you look at it from that view, you see that plants are attached to the ground. So it makes sense that they would be either carried with the mud layers in the waves of a great sea, or already still attached to the ground and just layered over with more mud layers, which would create plant fossils. That's why they would be the bottom layers, because they would be part of the dirt itself. But then you get to the sea animals. And you see that sea animals would be next because, let's think about it, they're already in the water. So while other animals are finding higher ground and stuff, these sea animals are getting laid down in this mud. And then you have dinosaurs and slower land animals, the ones which can't escape the water quite as well as humans can. And then you have birds, which would have gotten caught up in it last, okay? Now, the reason why I haven't listed humans in here is because there's not really any fossils on humans, are there? There is actually a fossil of a human footprint inside of a dinosaur's footprint. So if you ever wondered if dinosaurs and humans were living around the same time, they definitely were, because there's no way to put a human footprint fossilized inside of a dinosaur's footprint that's fossilized, except for if they were living together. But also because humans, their bodies, they blow up with gas when you die. There's all the gases in your body which start to blow you up, and then you float. And so your body's not going to be underneath the water getting tossed around with all that other stuff. It's going to be either buried very shallowly, where water washing off of the earth could unbury you again, or it's going to be floating around and just laying on top of the ground when the water leaves. So that's why most bodies are not there. Okay, well, we're going to talk about the biblical verses which back this up. So Genesis 7, 1-4, Emily Ann has.
Then the Lord said to Noah, "Enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. You shall take with you every clean animal by sevens, and male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean too, a male and a female. Also of the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For after 7 more days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made."
Okay, and then Sydney has verse 18:21-21.
So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by their families from him. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, "I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing, as I have done."
Okay, so I just remembered something which I was supposed to say about the birds. By the way, birds, they could stay flying for quite a while, honestly, but birds can't stay flying indefinitely. And that is why the birds would have ended up in the water eventually and made it into fossils, because there would have been nowhere for them to rest if the whole earth was covered. Sorry, that was something which I needed to mention, because what reason would birds have to be spending time in a prehistoric sea, by the way? There's no reason for that. But if the entire earth is covered, there's no place for them to rest. Sorry, forgot to mention that part, but it's important. Okay, but yes, thank you, Sydney and Emmy, for reading those 2 passages. So that's the biblical basis for this story. It's the flood, right? I didn't have time to read it all, but it's really an important story, which you guys can go back and read the whole thing and understand exactly what God's purpose was in sending those floodwaters all over the earth, and why he wiped out every single thing that was living except for that which was in the ark, which trusted in God and which God was preserving, right? Okay, now let's look at some other things which are against the idea of evolution. For one thing, if you have this prehistoric shallow sea, which is laying down a rock layer, it's going to happen over millions of years is what they said, and then they'll have the next layer laid down millions of years later. Now the problem with that is trees. You guys have, a lot of you guys use wood to burn your fires, right? If you leave that wood for a year or 2 in the yard, it starts to do what? Decay? Yeah, I heard it somewhere. It starts to decay. It becomes that crumbly stuff, which is kind of messy and makes a big mess. And it does still burn, but it's very messy. And if you left it for a few more years, it probably turned into just a pile of dust, right? So wood decays quite quickly, honestly speaking. And in a lot of these different layers of rock, there's trees, which are vertical through them, which means that if it was millions and billions of years, you would only have that little bit of tree in the one layer. But if it was laid down quickly, you could have all of those layers and the tree sticking right through the middle, exactly like we see all over the place. There's multiple different occurrences of these trees, which are sticking through multiple layers of rock. And then we have Mount St. Helens. Now, this is a really interesting modern day example of what happened with the flood. In 1980, the Mount St. Helens erupted. I'm sure many of you guys heard about it. If you're an adult, if you're a kid, you may have heard about it in your science class. But what ended up happening with it is it sent down layers of hot ash and plasma, and it also sent a wave of water from Spirit Lake, which created layers in the exact way that we see in the Grand Canyon. There's actually something called the mini Grand Canyon at Mount St. Helens because of this event. And so then people went and they looked at it and they were astonished because this happened in a matter of days. Mount St. Helens going through this dramatic change. Drastic and dramatic was the two words I was trying to say. Dramatic change. And all of a sudden, they're like, wait a second, that happened like that. It was so quickly. And they had been expecting events like that to take millions and millions of years, but here it happened in days. And that's the same idea of what the flood happened. But let's revisit our radiometric dating, which we were supposed to revisit a few weeks ago, and we ran out of time with. Okay, so there's 3 flaws which they assume when they are doing radiometric dating. The first one is they assume the starting condition of the matter. They assume that it was at 100% parent material. Remember we talked about parent material and daughter material? Guys, do you remember that at all? I hope so, a little bit maybe. Okay, so parent material, the half-life is when it's half daughter and half parent material is what's happening with a radioactive isotope. Okay? And radioactive isotopes are always releasing particles from them, right? So when they release one particle, the other particle that's left behind is the daughter material. So the parent material has both particles, and the daughter material has just the one and has released the other. Okay? So when they are assuming that the starting condition is at 100%. Okay? And they can't know exactly how much God created the world with. He could have created it with the appearance of age, just like light, right? And so he could have created it with only 75% parent material and 25% daughter material already in it. He may have done it 100%. We don't know. That's the problem. Then they're also assuming that all the atoms in the isotope are from the original origin of the isotope. Now the problem is there's erosion. So things can be washed away. There is addition, where other isotopes get added on to another object. Another rock can contaminate another rock. They can contaminate each other, okay? And then the third thing which they're assuming is that the rate of decay has remained constant since the beginning of time. But events like the flood would have caused the rate of decay to be even faster. Think about it like this, okay? These isotopes are part of rocks, okay? What happens to rocks when you hit them with water? When a slow, steady drip of water, what ends up happening? They break down very slowly. They erode just a little bit every time. But what if you sent a torrent of water against that rock? They would break down faster. That's exactly it. Now what they're saying is the same amount of water has been hitting this rock for millions and billions of years, and that's why there's a hole in the rock. It was only one drip for millions and billions of years. But that's not consistent. That's not how nature works. Nature never stays consistent. It's always changing, right? Okay? And so they're assuming that the rate of decay remained constant. They're not accounting for things which are changing. Okay? But then we have two documented examples of inaccurate dating from radiometric dating, from carbon dating. Okay? The lava dome in Mount St. Helens, which cooled in 1984. So it's from the same explosion that we talked about with the mini Grand Canyon and Spirit Lake and everything. But this lava dome, it cooled in 1984. It takes a while for lava to cool sometimes. And it was tested in 1996, okay? Short amount of time, right? Not even like, it's 12 years. That's it, okay? It was dated to not 35, but 35,000 years, or 350,000 years, not 35. 350,000 years. The dome, which had cooled 12 years before they tested it, was dated by radiometric dating to 350,000 years before. That's a little off, I would say. Okay? Now, let's talk about a different one. Now, this one I didn't bring up before, but Mount, I'm not sure how to pronounce this. I think it's in Africa. But Mount Nguruhu, you might be able to find a better pronunciation for that. I don't know how to pronounce whatever language that is even in. It's a volcano, and it had lava flows which cooled and hardened less than 50 years ago, okay? So there are people who are still alive who remember the explosion which this happened for, okay? And it was dated to 3.5 million years, which means the further back they go, the more they add on. Proportionally, these don't divide up to the same number. And even when you compare it to like the 6,000 years that we believe the Earth to be, it's an even greater number. It's like 3.5 million years to the day compared to 6,000 years. That's a lot of years that they've added on, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, their gaps which they have. And so this is very good examples of people actually seeing this happen. These examples of what happened during the flood. And yet they're creating millions and billions of years off of this. And that shows that their radiometric dating ideas are very flawed in a lot of ways. They don't have accurate testing. And they can't get accurate testing either, because remember, we don't know what the original things were like, and they were not created new on the earth. They all were created at the very beginning of time and never were recreated once more. Okay? All right, so the one thing which I want to leave you guys with is the fact that when I say the Bible proves science, I mean that science is not the end-all be-all. The Bible is. It is truth. But you know what? Science doesn't contradict the Bible either. It is confirmed and upheld by the Bible. And so we can see that with the flood and see the layers and how they actually agree with the testimony of the flood.